Hi and welcome to my first video in the series about the blood transport system, and today we're going to be looking at the different types of blood vessels. So in this topic, these are the types of things that we have to cover, and so you have things like what hemoglobin and myoglobin do, the transport of oxygen and the Bohr shift, so that's to do with dissociation curves, pulmonary and systemic circulation. So pulmonary means the blood system to the lungs, systemic means the blood system to the rest of the body. The different types of blood vessels, things to do with blood pressure and velocities, and venous return, and arteriovenous difference. And the thing that we're going to focus on today are basically the blood vessels. And so, the blood vessels that you have in your body, some of them can work towards taking blood away from the body, and they normally take oxygenated blood. And by the term oxygenated, we mean to say it has a higher concentration of oxygen in than deoxygenated blood, and deoxygenated blood is normally carried in veins, which normally go back to the heart. So there are three major blood vessels that you find within the body: arteries, which carry oxygenated blood away from the heart; veins, which carry blood back to the heart; and capillaries, are the site of exchange. And so you find capillary beds around tissues and around organs, and it's the site at which oxygen and carbon dioxide and glucose are exchanged. Now, if we look at first our arteries and we look at what they look like, with an artery it has quite a small lumen. Now, a lumen's termed as basically the hole in which the blood flows through, and like nearly all of the blood vessels, they have an endothelial layer, so an endothelium, which is usually quite thin. With arteries, they have very thick elastic fibre and smooth muscle tissue, so that section of them is quite thick. And it needs to be quite thick because it needs to be able to withstand the high pressures that arteries take the blood at. And so therefore, if they weren't thick enough, they could potentially burst, and that could cause damage. You also have the outer layer, which is labelled here as collagen fibres. You may see this labelled in your book as something else, but essentially your outer layer, or your tunica externa, as it may be labelled in your book, again is of a reasonable thickness. If we compare this to veins, you can see there the major difference. If I flick back and forth, you can see that the vein has a much bigger lumen, and the reason for that is it carries the blood at a much lower pressure, and so that means that having a bigger lumen reduces the amount of friction, and therefore the blood can more easily flow back to the heart. Because it carries it at lower pressure, this is why it needs to be much, much bigger. Again, the endothelial layer, or has an endothelium there, it has a much thinner elastic and smooth muscle section, and the reason for that is, again, it carries it at lower pressure, and so therefore it doesn't need to be elastic, and it doesn't need to stretch in the same way that arteries do. And again, you have this external tunica external, your collagen fibres on the outside of the vein. The final one that we look at is just the capillary, and this is the smallest of all of the blood vessels, and it just consists of a very small lumen and a very, very thin endothelial layer. And so basically, if you looked at veins and arteries, essentially they all consist of, they have a lumen, an endothelial layer, they have elastic fibres and smooth muscle and collagen fibres. The same with the vein. The capillary is just the endothelial layer. Now, there are other types of blood vessels that I haven't mentioned here, and these are these two labelled here, so an arterial and a venule. Now, the artery carries the blood away from the heart, and those then branch out into smaller blood vessels called arterioles. And all arterioles are a smaller version of arteries. And so you can, if you were to look at a cross-sectional diagram of an artery, it would just be, of an arteriole, it would just be a much smaller version. And in much the same way is the venule. The venules are smaller versions of veins, and those collect together here to form a larger vein. You'll also notice here it's got in the middle here this capillary bed, and so what you can look at in terms of the artery, it goes from being quite a thick blood vessel, becoming progressively thinner, and down to the thinnest blood vessels, which are capillaries. They begin to thicken to produce the venules, and then those collect together to produce the veins. A collection of capillaries is sometimes referred to as a capillary bed, and because the capillaries are very thin, they're very good at exchanging materials like oxygen, carbon dioxide and glucose. If you join me on my next video, where we'll be looking at some other adaptations, particularly with veins, and also looking at vasoconstriction and vasodilation.